Greetings. I'm Lisa Anderson, Special Lecturer and Dean Emerita of Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. And on behalf of SIPA's Institute of Global Politics and Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, I'm pleased to welcome you to this rapid response assessment of the fall of the government in Syria. The success of the Syrian rebel efforts to unseat Bashar al-Assad after 5 decades of his family's rule surprised and shocked nearly everyone. Their swift takeover of Aleppo and then Damascus seems to have faced little resistance, suggesting that despite recent attempts to rehabilitate him in the Arab world, Assad's historic allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran, and Russia, could or would not any longer support the regime as they had for decades. But what can we expect in the coming weeks and months in Syria, regionally, and internationally? The Middle East kaleidoscope is turned once again, and the patterns of alliance and rivalry are shifting in potentially dramatic ways. I'm delighted to be joined by 3 distinguished analysts of regional politics. Briefly, let me introduce them, and then I will pose some questions. John Alterman is the Senior Vice President, Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair of Global Security and Geostrategy, and Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He has also served on the policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department and as former Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Kim Ghattas, who is an inaugural IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellow here at SIPA, is author of Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. She is a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Jerome Drevon is Senior Analyst on Jihad and Modern Conflict at the International Crisis Group. He joined the Crisis Group from the International Committee of the Red Cross, where he was advisor for non-state armed groups. His book, From Jihad to Politics, How Syrian Jihadis Embraced Politics, was published just this September. So I thought I would start this conversation and the questions we're pondering in 3 concentric circles, or at least at the outset. Internal Syrian politics, the immediate neighborhood, and then regional and international politics. Running through it all, of course, is that everyone, including, as far as I can tell, the victorious rebels themselves, were surprised by the ease and rapidity with which the regime's support collapsed. So let me start with you, Jerome, and ask you to tell us a little bit about the rebel group that seems to have been victorious, whether it was surprised, how they arranged this offensive without drawing attention to themselves, and who this leader, whose nom de guerre Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, or as we might say, Golani, might approach the prospect of ruling. It's a lot of questions. Pick the one you want.
Thank you for these questions. When we look at the Syrian armed opposition groups that have taken over Damascus over the past 2 weeks, we actually have to differentiate 3 types of groups or broader alliances. First, there is the main one, which is the alliance led by HTS and some of its closer allies. So those are united in a military alliance, which is by far the most structured and the most organized. So I will go back to this one. Then we have the so-called Syrian National Army, which includes the remnants of what was previously known as the Free Syrian Army. Some of these groups are very local, some of these groups are more Islamists, some of these groups are more on the criminal side of the spectrum, considering their activities in the north of Aleppo. And then there are groups from the south of the country that were formerly part of the Southern Front that was mostly coordinated by Jordan up to 2016, when the south was reconquered by the regime and its foreign supporters. So those are far less organized because for the past few years, they've tried to reconcile, quote unquote, in a way with the regime, even though it was a difficult process. Many of them have been killed. But when they saw the military success from the north, decided to also take back their weapons and to go into Damascus. So as I was mentioning, the main alliance that really triggered all the succession of events is the military alliance between HTS and smaller groups, including Ahl Hasham, Felak Hasham, and smaller groups from the Idlib region. those really did not expect first to be able to take Aleppo, but let alone taking later on, Hama, Homs, and going to into Damascus. Initially, the objective was more about putting back some military pressure on the regime, on the cross lines. But ultimately, they realized that the regime was much weaker than expected. So even though, for example, Turkey did not want a battle for Aleppo, not that it did not want the rebellion to take over Aleppo, but it feared that if it failed, it would further degrade the situation in the north. So what we see in the short term are a succession of events that were really unplanned and that ended up with the removal of the regime. But the trigger of the conflict, or rather the preparation, had been ongoing for much, much longer than that. It's not something that was just planned for the past few months. With Crisis Group and other organizations, we've been traveling to Idlib for the past 5 years. And what happened basically started kind of in 2020. When in 2020, the unofficial ceasefire was brokered between Turkey and Russia, the rebellion understood that it could not actually protect itself because it could have failed without Turkish support. So it used the ceasefire to basically reconstruct. So even though we have still the same names of the groups, actually what they mean in practice is very different. They have totally restructured their brigades, they have improved military training, they have recruited new soldiers, they have created a military academy to become more professional and to act as an army. So now the command is much more unified than ever before. There is much more command and control. There is more specialization, including with new units like drones and so on. So the level of professionalism that we've seen is not a recent outcome. It's something that they have planned for the past few years, because somehow they thought that in the long run, if they were better organized, they could take potentially over the regime, even though we did not really take it very seriously because we thought those are wild dreams. What they really want is just to consolidate, not really take over Damascus. Well, ultimately they were prepared enough to do so, and so it happened very quickly. So they launched the hostilities, then groups from the Syrian National Army joined in, and when they really started to reach Hama and then Homs, then people from the south decided to also take it into their own hands and to go into Damascus, which further weakened the regime. So basically, we see a rapid succession of events that have much longer roots, which means now that it's a real challenge for the armed opposition, because had they only conquered Aleppo, somehow it would have been a challenge, but more contained, because even though it's a large city, it's one city that's close to Idlib. So somehow what they had in terms of experience of governance within the Idlib region, they could have exported it to Aleppo to some extent. But now the picture is totally different, because now they're the seat of government, so they have to reach out to foreign countries, they have to reach out to one another, and they have to do something that they were really not prepared for. So it's full of challenges, and they don't really have responses for that because it was really not expected. And so they don't have solutions, so things are going to unfold as we speak, and it's very even difficult to predict what could happen within 6 months, 1 year. Hopefully it's not going to go into chaos. The first decisions were quite positive, trying to tame sectarian thoughts or sectarian speech, saying that we want some continuity with the previous with what remained of previous institutions, so that we can avoid what happened in Libya, where factions just took over different parts of the state, becoming different security services or taking command of different ministries. They are trying to avoid that. Also trying to avoid what happened in Iraq, where the states just crumbled after the US invasion.
No, it's interesting because that they may be learning lessons from other cases as they're going along. I have more questions for you, but in fairness, I want to come back to, and perhaps, Kim, you can also speak to this, why it was that they were permitted to do all of that rebuilding while they were in Idlib. People must have been aware of the fact that they were preparing to make trouble for the regime. So I'm surprised that didn't draw attention. But in the meantime, Kim, let me ask you, what impact is this going to have on all of the neighbors, including everyone who has been hosting Syrian refugees and been assuming, as we all did for the last 50 years, that this regime would outlast all of us?
Lisa, I first want to just comment on the incredible, detailed and expert information that Jerome shared with us, because what it does is emphasize also that this was really a success that was made possible by the Syrians themselves. This was not US tanks driving down to Damascus. This was not a UN authorized international intervention. This was 13 years of blood and tears by the Syrians. And then at the end, 4 years of preparation, as Jerome just explained, and an incredible confluence of events, which meant that that preparation paid off in ways that even the rebels did not expect. Because I think that the Russians and the Iranians would have wanted to preserve their key ally in the region, an ally they've counted on for decades, since 1979 for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and much longer for Russia, previously the Soviet Union with the Ba'ath Party and Hafiz al-Assad. I don't think they just said, oh, this is not worth us fighting for anymore. I think they were also taken by surprise, stunned by the advances of the rebels. And that's because they've been otherwise occupied. The Iranians were busy with the unity of France since October 7th and the devastating war against Hezbollah and the Israeli strikes against targets inside Iran itself. And they were perhaps not paying attention to what the rebels were doing. And similarly for Russia. Russia was otherwise occupied with Ukraine. And when the moment came to suddenly save Bashar al-Assad, I think they were too stunned and they couldn't organize quickly enough. And in particular, they realized that this regime was even weaker than they thought. His army did not want to fight anymore for him because he had promised that if they did, life would improve for them in regime-controlled areas, and it did not. And I think that's what allowed this rapid advance to also be fairly bloodless. And Jerome can correct me or add to that. It was fairly bloodless because people were just exhausted. The impact, I think, first, I do want to also, and I will come to your question, but it's part of the answer because it's part of the impact on the region and Syria's neighbors. The incredible elation mixed with apprehension, mixed with joy, mixed with mourning inside Syria is really something to behold. And we must now all, I think, support Syrians as they go through this transition, which HTS was not expecting they would have to undertake in a big city like Damascus. I want to address briefly the impact on Lebanon. Lebanon was under Syrian occupation for 35 years until 2005. It was a corrupt, violent, terrible occupation of that country that is not very well understood, and not much has been written about it. And it was, and the Syrian regime was responsible for ordering the murder and the assassination of many of Lebanon's leaders across the decade since 1976, but also since 2005 by Bashar al-Assad himself, our former prime minister, intellectuals, politicians, members of parliament were assassinated on the orders of Bashar al-Assad and the Iranian regime. So the impact on Lebanon, coming at a time when Hezbollah is weakened as well, is an opportunity for Lebanon to free itself from the remnants of this old system that was upheld by Iran and Syria in Lebanon, and to some extent by the Lebanese system itself. And it reminds me a little bit of the film Goodbye Lenin, where this young man tries to preserve the illusion of the Soviet Union and East Berlin still existing for his mother. And I fear that the Lebanese, that my country, is not going to seize this moment to really push for reform and is going to uphold a system that actually doesn't exist around Lebanon anymore. When it comes to refugees, I think we've already seen thousands of them going back. I also think that clearly signals that the refugee crisis that arrived on the shores of Europe in 2014, 2015, etc., which Europe tried to solve by either normalizing with Bashar al-Assad at some point, including Italy, which sent an ambassador just last month back to Damascus, or by, playing nice with dictators like Kais Saied in Tunisia. The answer to a refugee crisis is not to perpetuate the false stability afforded by dictatorships. The solution is for these people to be able to go back home to a country that is stable, democratic, etc., which I know is a tall order, but watching all these people trying to come back already is quite a sight to behold and shows that no one wants to be a refugee. Having said that, I also think that countries in Europe need to be patient and not try to suddenly push everybody back to Syria, because we don't know. First of all, many of them may not have homes anymore. Second of all, there might be chaos coming. And so we don't want to then provoke another refugee crisis. But I think that we are watching a dramatic reordering of the Middle East, particularly because the Russian-Iran axis is severely damaged. I'm not going to say defeated or broken, but severely damaged. And the key now is to make sure there's no void and chaos in Damascus so that they are not able to fill that void instead of the US and other more responsible actors.
Okay, lots to follow up on that too. I'm curious so this will be one of my follow-up questions for you, but sort of Hezbollah was already back-footed after all of the war with Israel in the last months. I'm just sort of curious about what their prospects will be under these circumstances. But first, John, I want to go to you and really zoom out a little bit more even. How does this change, if at all, Israel's calculus in Gaza, Lebanon, and the West Bank? The Israelis have clearly been energetically degrading the Syrian military capacity in this moment of, I suppose, vacuum. How are they thinking about it? How then are Egypt and the Gulf thinking about this? I mean, they had just begun to warm up again to Assad. And it seems to me, and again, this is unfair, it's too many questions, but it seems to me that this really constitutes a defeat for Russia that's really quite dramatic. So tell us how this looks from those vantage points.
From those 8 vantage points, make
exactly.
Perfect.
Exactly.
First, let me say what an honor it is to be on this panel, not only with the panelists, but with Lisa Anderson, who I studied with 35 years ago. And if somebody said, this is what the world is going to look like in 35 years, you'd say that's crazy. Because I think Tim captured it this is a profound reordering of the Middle East in a way that even 6 months ago was almost unimaginable. And I think this, from an Israeli perspective, I've spoken to Israelis about this. This is the key point that Netanyahu has been making a series of, I would argue, pretty bold gambles in the last 6 months, pushing back the Biden administration, saying we're not going to take your deal on the hostages and a ceasefire. I think incredibly, not only having exchanges directly with Iran, which would have been unthinkable, but then the attacks in Lebanon in September, the death of any number of leaders who Israel considered its adversaries, and Israel not really feeling like it suffered, rather that it advanced. And now I think with the departure of Assad and a sense that Iran has lost this profound foothold in the Levant, its ability to resupply Hezbollah, that I think that there is in Israel this sense of disbelief that so many things appear to be going the Israelis' way. I think it is premature for them to celebrate, but it is unimaginable just how much the structure of the region is in flux compared to what we even thought was possible 6 months ago, to let alone what Hamas intended to do on October 7th, 2023. I think we have a number of really serious questions that remain deeply uncertain. Jerome was I think, really helpful describing what HTS intends, but the nature of rule in Syria is a huge question mark. What will happen to jihadis who either escape from Syrian prisons or escape from SDF prisons in the East? And what do they do? And how do outside powers try to play with them, try to use disorder to advance their own interests? I think is a large question. We haven't mentioned Turkey at all. And Turkey obviously has a huge role in all of this. It seems to me that there's a profound set of questions about what is Turkey looking to do? What are they willing to offer whom? For what? How does Turkey intend to get things from the Gulf? How does Turkey intend to box out Russia? How does Turkey intend to engage with Europe, with the Trump administration? I mean, for Turkey, this is not only the moment of a generation, this is the moment of a century to recast the region to Turkey's advantage. What will they try to lock in with the Kurds? To me, there's a whole set of mysteries about how Turkey will play not only the coming month, how Turkey will play the coming years, because I think Erdogan, who has desperately sought to be a regional power player, is becoming a global power player because of the shadow he can cast on the region. I am a little bit cautious about how much this is going to set back either the Iranians or the Russians. I think the Iranians play a long, patient game. They played a long, patient game in Iraq, and I think got things over to their side. They have a big stake, as you pointed out, as Kim pointed out. They've been investing in Syria for many decades. I don't think they're willing to walk away quite yet. What I've seen from the Iranians is they have a combination of, we'll show you how we can be helpful, but we'll remind you how we can inflict pain. They are really good at developing their asymmetrical tools. I think Iran will seek to be a player constructively and destructively in Syria simultaneously. How consequential that'll be, I don't know. I see the Russians as profoundly cynical in their entire approach to the Middle East. The Russians love to be bottom feeders. They love to play on cases in situations of countries that are suffering, and they try to make small investments to get big gains. That's what they did in Syria in 2015 in a sort of acute moment. But I see the Russians offering themselves up to whoever is in charge in Syria and saying, we're your safety valve. If you're worried about being under the thumb of the Turks, we'll be your safety valve. If you're worried about the Americans and the Europeans lecturing you about human rights, we'll defend you on the Security Council. I think there is nothing the Russians won't promise in order to secure not only their naval base and their air base, but to secure some sort of leverage in the Levant. And it is possible for me to imagine any number of scenarios where rulers in Damascus will feel they want an unscrupulous global power as a partner, and the Russians will make whatever deal is on offer. So to me, this is a moment, Kim very passionately and I think correctly described this as a moment of opportunity. But I think for everybody, not just the Israelis, but for everybody in the region, this is the big game. There's a lot at stake. It's going to go on for many years to come. And you have a European Union which remains unable to really act effectively in a shared way, and a United States which not only is going through what will be a 6-month presidential transition until people are in place and it's clear what's going on and they have policies worked out and all those things, but a president who is profoundly transactional, was willing to hand over Syria to the Turks before. I think that, as I read it, the United States is poised to be much less consequential than you might otherwise think if there's a situation where the Russians and the Iranians are in play. And I don't know where this comes out. And to me, it's just, it's paralyzing just how many possibilities, even in the near term, there are.
Well, that's what we are here to try and sort out a little bit, but I agree with you. This is an unusually complicated moment. Jerome, I want to come back to you, actually, because one of the dynamics in Libya, for example, was the extent to which outside powers basically developed clients, and that has been part of the dynamic that has prevented a coming together on the part of many of the Libyan factions and militias and so forth. What kind of role do you think the people who are anticipating taking power see for outside supporters? In other words, do they think of themselves as being able to shop themselves around to whoever will give them the most of whatever it is they want? Do they have ideological commitments? Do they have historical commitments? Are they more nationalist than that? Tell us a little bit how they think about their place in the world.
I think I will start with one of the points that Kim mentioned, which is a very critical point. What's brilliant somehow with this takeover of Damascus is that in the most internationalized civil war of the past 2 decades, potentially, those who actually ended up the war, one way or another, by taking over the regime, were Syrians themselves. And states did play a role one way or another. There is a Turkish coordination and some type of support. There must have been discussions with Iran and Russia by the end for the toppling of Damascus, of Bashar al-Assad. But ultimately, those were choices that Syrians themselves did, and mostly by themselves without external bombing. And if we look at it, aside from maybe like the first 2 years of conflict in which really external players were trying to really influence their own groups, playing with one another and so on, Syrian armed groups, for good or bad, for the past few years, have shown a lot of agency, even though that are closest to some countries like Turkey. And what's paradoxical is that sometimes even a country like Turkey find it difficult to even contain them or to impose its own decisions. Sometimes you can, as a country, say, now you fight, now you stop fighting, but how you fight, where you fight, how you do it, how you manage your relations, often the group themselves are very independent about it. And that leads to not just the agency of Syrians, but also how much development in terms of civil society there has been, including inside Syria, in those opposition-held areas. Often I find that analysts and researchers, foreigners, and so on speak about the local councils, which were an interesting experiment, but somehow this overshadows a range of associations, activities, syndicates, unions, etc., that have emerged in those areas. And I think Syrian civil society has been very, very active. So what we have to see when we think of the future is not only what groups are going to do in terms of their connections to one another, which is critical, but also how they're going to manage Syrian civil society and what role will Syrian civil society try to play. Because we cannot just see everything through the angle of foreign actors. Foreign actors will matter, and groups will try also to get things from foreign actors. Like HTS, for example, will want to have its listing by the UN Security Council, by states, etc., removed. So there will be negotiations over what type of governance can be accepted in Syria, but it's not going to be just between HTS and foreign governments. Like civil society will also play its role. They will try to push for their agendas, to push for their inclusion, and I think it gives a lot of hope. Also because Syrian civil society has developed a lot inside Syria and outside Syria, and I see also Syrians who are active outside, in Europe, in Turkey, in their abroad, etc., also trying to come back, trying to also play their role in terms of the accountability for the past former regime, but accountability also for the new actors that are there. And I think that's something encouraging that we have to follow up. So I think we should try to have an overall vision and to go beyond, the state proxy relationship, which often I think blurs more than it explains fully what groups do.
Oh, thank you very much. I think, again, I think in many ways you're describing an evolution over the last decade or so within Syria, and as Syrian actors think about their relationships with the rest of the world, with foreign actors, that perhaps they have been learning lessons from some of the other regional circumstances. Kim, I suggested you should tell us a little bit about what this is going to mean for Hezbollah, but I'd also like, since you've written on this, to know whether you have any thoughts about how the Saudis are going to be thinking about this, both in Syria and in Lebanon.
Sure. So I think Hezbollah is going to find itself very much cornered. It is the product of, not just the product of the Iranian project, of an Iranian project, but it was the crown jewel in that project. It is the first export of the Islamic Republic of Iran after it was established in 1979. In 1982, in the wake of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, began the setting up and the creation of Hezbollah, and the project jointly managed by Iran and the Ba'ath regime in Syria to thwart American influence in the Middle East and fight Israel via Lebanon, because Syria didn't want to go to war with Israel anymore, and Iran was too far, so they thought they'd do it via Lebanon and Hezbollah. 42 years later, Hezbollah now finds itself, after an apogee of its power, it had really become a regional paramilitary armed force, one of the most powerful non-state armed actors in the world, with footprint in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. It is now reduced back to what it was in 1982, a local guerrilla group cornered in Lebanon, and even worse than in 1982, because I don't think it can rely on weapons shipments coming through Syria to Lebanon anymore. In addition, locally, the Lebanese have resented for a long time the chokehold that Hezbollah has held over the country's politics. So in an ideal world, one that we don't live in, Hezbollah should be reduced to just another political party. They do have support, they have a popular base, they have members in parliament, they even have allies in the cabinet, but they should no longer be allowed to lay the law and, in essence, rule the country from behind the scenes. And that is, again, something that the rest of the Lebanese polity and politicians and civil society will now have to manage and deal with, keeping in mind that Lebanon's problems are not solely derived from Hezbollah's presence, but also impunity that reigned after the end of the civil war, the continued power that former warlords have, and what we call in Lebanon the mafia militia establishment, which has ruined this country. And I want to make a point here about Israel's grand ambitions and its opportunity, because in 1982, Israel also thought, with the invasion of Lebanon, that it had a grand opportunity to remake the Middle East. And it ended terribly. It looked great initially, but it ended terribly. It ended with the rise of Hezbollah, with the powerful Iran, with Syria occupying Lebanon. And we've dealt with the consequences of this for the last 4 decades. So I think it's very important for the United States, the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration, to have a serious talk with their allies in Israel to curb their enthusiasm about continuing to use military force to reshape the region. They can take a victory lap if they want. This was a devastating year for the Middle East, 40,000 dead or more in Gaza, 4,000 dead in Lebanon, the economy devastated. Not many people will want to admit that that has resulted now in the demise of Assad and the weakening of Hezbollah thanks to Israeli actions. But I think the reality on the ground shows that that is what happened. But the continued Israeli strikes on Syria, their land grab on the Golan Heights, and their continued strikes against Lebanon risk undermining all that and pushing the region further into chaos. So I think it's very important to make sure that Israel stops using military force to continue on this, winning streak that it seems to think it is in. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, they were the first they were the first Arab country to suggest to the United States in 2012 to arm the Syrian rebels. And it came as a shock to Secretary Hillary Clinton at the time. I was on a trip with her as BBC correspondent, and she couldn't believe that the Saudis were suggesting that. They described at the time Bashar al-Assad as an occupier. They've come a long way since then in the sense that they've adjusted to the reality that Bashar al-Assad wasn't seemingly going anywhere, and they have also normalized with him because they have some problems that they needed to address, including the illicit trade of drugs and particularly Captagon. I suspect that they're not unhappy to see the end of Bashar al-Assad. They'll be worried about chaos. They'll be worried about Turkey's role in all of this. There are all these rivalries. The UAE will also be very worried about HTS sitting in Damascus as the new ruling authority. And I think, again, it is important that whoever has power, the UN, the US, others, make sure that this does not become a free-for-all again in Syria, and that we give space to the Syrians to manage this transition and support them, rather than use this territory as a place for more power plays and power games. And that leads me, if you'll allow me just one more point, Lisa, to Russia. I would never dare disagree with John, but I would like to make one point, which is that the Syrian people are not soon going to forget the devastating role that Russia played in supporting Bashar al-Assad and bombing them to death, including civilian hospitals, civilian targets. And so I'm not sure that many people in Syria, no matter what Russia offers, are going to be willing to overlook that and say, yeah, let's partner up. But, you know, I might be wrong.
No, thank you for that. And actually, John, I was going to pose this sort of, it does seem to me that just as the United States was penalized for sheltering the Shah in Iran, I suspect that the Syrians are going to penalize the Russians in some respects also for having been the where Assad took asylum. So I just wondered, but more broadly, how do you? So that's still a question about Russia, but more broadly, the question of, I think you're right, Israel's clearly being audacious. Kim thinks they're probably, I'm going to put words in your mouth, overplaying their hand. To what extent does the United States have any capacity under either of the American administrations to really give advice to the Israelis on this?
We can give the Israelis advice. I'm not sure the Israelis will take advice. As I said, I think from Netanyahu, Netanyahu is a much more risk-averse actor than I think most people have thought him to be, but he's taken an awful lot of risks in the last 6 months. And I would argue from his perspective, he'd argue that all of them, the more audacious they are, the better off they've turned out. And I think Kim's expression of caution about where this might go is well taken. And I think we could see everything from an effort to have an armed attack on the Iranian nuclear program. I think as long as Netanyahu thinks that his gambles are paying off, it is hard to get him to walk away from the table and say enough is enough. So I think that's one thing that we have to be looking for over the next 6 months to a year, is under what circumstances would Netanyahu decide that this is good enough. And I think it's unrealistic to expect the Trump administration is going to try to restrain him. They may say, we're not going to be there with you. But I think that the idea of restraint coming out of the Trump administration is unlikely. I mean, there's all kinds of speculation about whether an Iran deal with Israel or an Iran deal with the United States is possible. I tend to be, I think it's very possible to have a negotiation. I'm much more skeptical about a successful negotiation. But, watch this space. On the issue of Syrian hostility to the Russians, I think that's true. But I could imagine any number of circumstances where the rulers in Damascus would make an accommodation to the Russians, not because it's popular, but because it serves their strategic needs. And depending on how democratic the government is, they may decide that some sort of accommodation with Russians serves their interests.
Hey, I'm going to turn to, we've got dozens and dozens of questions from the audience, as you can well imagine. And so let me begin to address a few of those. We've got, Jerome, this is for you, a lot of puzzling over what kind of relations the HTS government might have with the Kurds, with religious minorities. What kind of approach are they likely to take, not only with like-minded groups, but people who are plausibly understood as not happy about their prevailing?
So that's, I think, one of the key questions with regards to the future of Syria. I think what happened in Idlib for the past 5 years, where HTS is de facto in control, gives some lessons, but that are limited because the situation is going to be different. So what we've seen for the past 5 years is that HTS has maintained some authoritarian approach to politics. So it does control the political representation of Idlib. It does not really tolerate, it has not really tolerated political dissidents, but that has accompanied a growing openness to religious minorities and to Muslims who disagree with its views. So many meetings have been arranged with Christians and Druze. The main issue with the Christians at the time, and the Druze as well, was about their properties. Many of their properties had been seized with refugees coming from other regions. So HTS has contributed to the restoring the proper Christian ownership of these properties. At the same time, HTS has allowed religious ceremonies such as Christmas and Easter, but maintains some restrictions. For example, ringing the bell is not allowed. The cross is not on the churches, and so on. So some religious restrictions remain. Their claim at the time was saying, no, this is temporary and this can change over time. But now the question will be to the extent to which they can also include other parts of society within their governance project, or part of the governance to which are going to be associated in Damascus. They have shown that they can make some concessions to civil society when there is pressure. When society refuses some of their regulations, they have actually stepped back. So they have a potential of continuing to do so, but that will mostly depend on how strong also is civil society, how organized and cohesive civil society can be to potentially push back at some of these policies. So that's an important question mark. HTS now recognizes that ruling Aleppo would have been different from ruling Idlib. So let alone ruling the country is going to be very different from ruling Idlib. So they will have to acknowledge that. They have made some efforts to transform, but much more is needed. And that's a question mark, whether they can really transform, from what they were in the Northwest to partially being the ruling entity. With regards to the Kurds, I think that's also an important challenge. What happens to the SDF? What happens to the regions under their control? I think the main immediate risk does not necessarily come from HTS, which is more organized and has clear views in how this plays with their international relations. It comes mostly from some factions of the National Army that are not as structured, but still, there is still a risk of conflict. So that we will have to see also what foreign players are doing to contain a potential conflagration, be it Turkey or the US mostly. So no clear response. I mean, there are many more questions and question marks than responses. But if the past is an indication of the future, it's a group that can be managed, that can make concessions, but it depends also on a range of factors, including the weight of other actors and how much they can pressure the group.
Let me follow up with you on a somewhat different angle, and Kim's observation about the importance of the illicit drug trade that had been developing in Syria and the region leads me to ask this. What is the economy going to look like? Where is the money that is going to be needed to pay the military and pay the bureaucracy and so forth and so on? To what extent is there an economy in Syria that is not mostly the illicit drug trade that can be built on? And to what extent is that going to be something that all of the foreign actors are trying to use as a way of capturing clients? So this is for you, Jerome, and then I'm going to go to Kim.
Sorry, I thought it was.
Sorry.
I mean, to a large extent, the economy is, I mean, everything has to be rebuilt. I mean, first of all, you have to stabilize governance. So you have to find a way to associate different actors. But then a lot will depend also on what they are doing to reach out to other countries. Because the country is in dire need, first of humanitarian assistance, but not only. It will need reconstruction. It will need investment. There are many Syrians in the diaspora that can invest, but we are speaking of much larger investments from Gulf countries, from European countries, from the US, the role of UN agencies, and so on. And so basically, also when we are thinking of HTS, of the type of governance that can be established in Syria, we can't ignore the foreign factor. So I said earlier, you know, an agency is critical, and it is critical, but foreign actors will also play a role in the future of the country. So HTS and others, whoever is in charge in Damascus, whatever the form, will also require foreign relations. And so it means that foreign actors will also have a large sway over the type of governance that can exist within Syria, how inclusive it is, what constitutional form, will there be elections, when there will be elections, etc. I do trust Syrians to invest in their country and to rebuild it, but a lot will have to do with those foreign relations to simply rebuild the economy and start to rebuild the cities, because the regime has been unable to do so. Because the failure of the regime ultimately is the failure of a regime after its so-called victory at the end of 2016 to actually reform, to rebuild. Eastern Aleppo is still destroyed. Big parts of Aleppo, of Homs are still destroyed. I mean, the Ghouta and so on. I mean, nothing has really been done. So it's about now recreating a real economy. The new government that's going to be in charge till March is saying that they want to also open up the economy, to also reach out to foreign actors, because they really don't have any other alternative to that.
So Kim, do you envision economic investment being constructive? And who would be the kinds of countries or actors to whom this government might turn? And John, I'm going to ask you the same kind of question, because of course, you know, this is a group that is under American sanction. There are, you know, still American troops in Syria. There's a lot of sorting out from the American end, not to say the other kinds of investors. So I'm interested in everyone telling me who's going to be helping lead a rebuilding of the economy. So slightly apart from the politics, although obviously they are intimately related. You're muted, Kim.
So I think that when it comes to the rebuilding of the economy, everyone is going to be interested, because there's an opportunity there to help to make money. I mean, neighboring countries, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, everybody, I think, will see an opportunity to help rebuilding. But how that is done and how organized this can be is going to require some, you know, general oversight, as Jerome was saying. You have to remember that we're not just dealing with a country that's been at war, but a country that has been kind of still living and being run with, you know, state-controlled economy that is a remnant of a Soviet system, where the bureaucracy is hollow, where you know, there are departments inside ministries for putting up flags. There's a great article in the Financial Times today or yesterday looking at this meeting that was set up by HTS to talk to various directors of ministry to understand how things were running. And there were just the most random departments. Like there was a department for publicity and marketing in one of the ministries. And the only thing these people did was put up flags when foreign dignitaries would visit. So it's a bloated bureaucracy. Some of it is a hollow and with phantom employees, and transferring that to a functioning economy that is a market economy, that is going to be a huge challenge for HTS, especially because, and I keep thinking about that, they were not ready to be leading a country. They may have been able to manage Aleppo, but now they're suddenly leading a country. And it sounds to me, but Jerome is really the expert, that Galani has some humility, or has developed some humility over the last few years. He's learned a few lessons, and he has tempered his views and understands that he can't just do it on his own. And I think that is going to require, as I said, the UN, international assistance, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. There is another aspect that I want to raise, which is not directly related to the economy, but to a general peaceful transition. And that's the human element, because dictatorships also stand on the shoulders of your everyday person who is willing to enact the horrors of that ruler. And just like in private situations of families where the children who have been abused become themselves abusers, you have the people at the top who gave out the orders, but you also have all the people, the rank and file, who had to execute these orders and who carry deep, deep trauma. And whether it's within ministries or police stations or schools, or I think it's important to also look at that element of the healing of a society that has been confronted with so much violence, but also made to mete out a lot of violence. And I think that that's where retribution killings can come in. That's where other types of abuses can unfold as well. And I just think that we have to keep that human element in mind.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very well taken point. John, what is the United States going to do about the troops in Syria? What is the United States going to do about the sanctions? I understand that right now it's sort of hard to tell who the United States is being represented by in this, but what's the kind of process that would begin to develop within the US government to think about, rather than simply throwing some more troops in? That's not the approach. There needs to be a different way of thinking about a productive American role.
I think the process is actually straightforward, which is the Biden administration will try to maximize its leverage over the next 40 whatever days, working a process of gradually lifting American sanctions in exchange for demonstrated behavior by leadership in Damascus, trying to get things in exchange. And I think that in the broader time frame, I think a couple things are clear. One is the Trump administration's instinct will be very much get American troops out of Syria. That's the direction. How quickly we get there, I don't know, but that's going to be the direction. I think that there's a question of conditionality and how much the U.S. will hold back in looking for what. And I think there's a broader question, as Kim was talking about the profound needs in Syria, and there are a huge number of really profound needs. But I think that a lot of groups, including Gulf Arabs, who have the capacity to meet a lot of those financial needs, are going to be looking and seeing, so what do I get in exchange? What kinds of guarantees? What kinds of environments do I want to include? How do I want to make sure the Iranians aren't just going to take this over? How are we going to make sure, in the case of the Emiratis, how do I make sure that the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't have a base in Syria? All those kinds of things. And I think that the world is going to have a problem, that Syria is going to have urgent needs, and a lot of the players with a capacity to meet those needs are going to be wondering, what can I get in exchange? How do I use the need to maximize my leverage. And how that game plays out, I think, is very unclear. I'm not sure who's going to lead it. I don't think the US will lead it.
All right. I think you're right. The US doesn't seem likely to lead that process. But, one more quick round. Jerome, if you were sitting in Damascus at Golani's side, who would you say are likely to be the most productive foreign interlocutors? And then I'm going to go to him and ask you, John.
Western countries. And I mean, even when we met him already, I mean, we have met him many times for the past few years, even before taking over Damascus, his thinking, him and his advisors, was always that we want strategic relations with Western countries, but through Turkey at the time, because Turkey was preponderant in the Northwest. But I think that the importance of Western country remains, because ultimately they have a larger say over sanctions, over listing, but also over reconstruction. Because, for example, I agree with John, what you were saying before about the role of Russia and so on, but I don't really see Russia reconstructing anything in Syria, while Western countries are much more likely to invest one way or another. So ultimately, the economic interests of Syria are much more served with Western countries, and I think they're very cognizant of this.
Him, same question. Who's going to help?
Same answer. I support Jerome's approach. I think that the Syrians should, first of all, look to themselves, the diaspora. There's a lot of highly educated, financially successful Syrians with, great degrees, knowledge, know-how, who want to be involved. I don't think that you will see the same kind of resentment inside Syria towards the diaspora that you sometimes had in Iraq versus the diaspora, because this is a recent diaspora that was forced out by Bashar violently, displaced, millions of refugees, etc. And so there isn't this sense of, oh, well, who do you think you are coming to lord it over us, which was a little bit the feeling in Iraq after 2003 with, well, the Ahmad Shalabis, but others as well. So I think they will look to the diaspora. They will look to the West, Europe. They will look to the US, and the US doesn't have to be involved with anything on the ground, but it can be a convening power. I think that's very important, and I think they will look to Gulf countries who might be interested in investing. But this should remain a Syrian-led process.
John, any final thoughts on who's going to help?
I think, again, the Turks are going to have a big voice in how this unfolds, how HTS relates to the Turks going forward, whether they're able to get Western help to push back the Turks a little bit, how that all plays out. I think there's a set of dynamics over the next 6 months that are going to unfold that are going to be very, very complicated and nuanced, and I think not straightforward at all.
Well, that's actually perfect, because what I was going to do is, we have run out of time. Clearly, lots more we can talk about. So I am going to invite us to reconvene in 6 months. And
I like that.
We will then be able to follow up on all of these questions. And in the meantime, let me thank you all very much. We clearly wish Syria well at this point, and we'll be following things closely. And your insights have been very useful to all of us. So again, thank you all very much. And thank you to SIPA and the IGP for sponsoring this discussion.